The cardboard sign was already there when Marcus Reed pulled into the cul-de-sac, leaning against his mailbox like an accusation. Property values matter. The black marker bled through the poster board, letters jagged and angry. Marcus sat in his car for a moment, engine ticking, listening to the low bass of his daughter's music from the back seat. The afternoon sun flattened everything into harsh light, every window watching, every lawn trimmed to judgment. Across the street, Carl Whitman stood with his arms folded, a smile tight as a knot. He didn't wave. He didn't need to. The message had been delivered. Marcus stepped out, smoothing his jacket, feeling that old familiar heat rise in his chest, the mix of anger and calculation. Neighbors drifted closer, pretending to water plants, pretending not to stare. His wife Denise joined him on the driveway, eyes flicking to the sign, then to Carl. Her hand found Marcus's, steady but cold. "This neighborhood has standards," Carl said, loud enough for everyone. "Some people forget that." Marcus looked at the sign again, at the way it reduced his family to a threat. He thought of the mortgage approval that took 3 banks. Of the HOA meetings he wasn't invited to. Of the silence that followed every complaint he filed. Then Carl leaned forward and delivered it softly, perfectly aimed. "You people should know your place." A phone camera clicked somewhere. Denise inhaled sharply. Marcus opened his mouth to respond. And across the street, a moving truck door rolled open, revealing something that made Carl's smile finally, unmistakably falter. Marcus Reed slowed to a stop at the end of the cul-de-sac, engine ticking in the afternoon heat. His eyes immediately found it. A crooked, sun-bleached cardboard sign propped against his mailbox. Property values matter. The letters were jagged, thick with black marker, bleeding into the cardboard. For a moment, he just stared, taking in the sign, the neighborly lawns that all seemed to lean judgmentally toward him, and the way the sunlight made every window a potential witness. "Marcus!" Denise's voice came from the passenger side, low and measured. She stepped out onto the driveway, her hand brushing the hem of her dress, and glanced at the sign, then at him. Their daughter, Kayla, followed, headphones slung around her neck, eyes scanning the street. Across the way, Carl Whitman lingered by his porch railing, arms crossed, chin up. He didn't wave. He didn't nod. The sign was enough. Marcus felt a familiar tightness coil in his chest, the mix of irritation, history, and the raw, simmering anger he had learned to control. Marcus stepped out, smoothing his jacket. "Is there a problem, Carl?" His voice was calm, measured. Carl's smile was thin, deliberate. "Just expressing concern," he said, voice carrying across the cul-de-sac. "This neighborhood has standards." "About a cardboard sign?" Denise asked. Her tone was flat, sharp. Carl shrugged, eyes flicking to her, dismissive. "Standards about investment, about who moves in. People forget sometimes." A neighbor pretended to water her plants, but the phone hidden in her hand captured every moment. Another lingered behind a curtain, eyes wide. Marcus felt all those gazes like a weight pressing him into the street, waiting for a reaction that would justify the message. Marcus's jaw tightened. "This is harassment." "Harassment," Carl echoed, the word rolling off his tongue like amusement. "Free speech, Marcus. Your rules don't cover sentiment." "They do cover signage," Denise said firmly, stepping closer to Marcus. Carl leaned forward slightly, voice dropping so only they could hear. "You people should know your place." Marcus froze for a heartbeat, tasting metal at the back of his throat. Denise exhaled sharply beside him. His daughter, sensing the tension, gripped her backpack strap and stayed silent. Marcus raised his phone, finger hovering over the camera. "Document it. Call it what it is." Carl laughed, confident, almost predatory. "Go ahead. I've lived here 30 years. Nothing will come of it." Marcus's shoulders relaxed, just slightly. 30 years doesn't give you the right to humiliate people. Before Carl could respond, a deep rumble filled the street. Diesel engines growled, and the back of a white moving truck came into view, shining in the sunlight. It rolled past the sign, past Carl, and stopped directly in front of the Reed's house. The rear doors swung open, revealing neatly packed crates stamped with international shipping labels. Carl's smile faltered, eyes widening as he took in the unexpected sight. His confidence wavered, a silent calculation forming behind his gaze. Marcus didn't say a word. He just watched, chest tight, hand still on his phone, waiting for Carl to realize something he had never imagined. Denise placed a steady hand on his arm, Kayla beside her, as the truck's cargo hinted at a truth that Carl's arrogance had never accounted for. And in that pause, the hot air, the quiet street, the hovering neighbors, Marcus felt the first real sense of power shift. The next morning, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold while his mind ran through the events of yesterday. Denise had already left for work, dressed in her crisp navy blazer, her phone buzzing in silent authority. Kayla hovered at the counter, scrolling through her phone, eyes widening at the social media posts that had already begun circulating. Photos of the sign, captions dripping with judgment, some subtle, some blunt. Marcus rubbed his forehead. "I hate this," he muttered. "The sign. The looks. Laughter. It's all calculated." Kayla shrugged. "It's always like this. People see you and they make up stories. Mom says it's just noise. Noise doesn't come with HOA approval and police dismissals," Marcus said, setting his cup down. "This is a system, Kayla. They expect silence, obedience, and that's how they stay in power." Her phone buzzed again. Marcus glanced at it. A text from Denise. "HOA meeting today, 4 p.m. Be ready." By mid-afternoon, Marcus and Denise walked into the HOA meeting, the room a polished, neutral rectangle of beige walls and fluorescent lights. The secretary's gaze lingered on Marcus longer than necessary as he signed in. Carl Whitman was already there, leaning back in a chair at the far end, smug, arms crossed. His smile didn't reach his eyes. It was purely performative, a mask he wore for the rest of the committee. The HOA president, a trim woman named Linda Hargrove, gestured toward Marcus. "We're here to discuss concerns about signage and neighborhood standards," she said, voice clipped, rehearsed. "Mr. Reed." Marcus cleared his throat. "Yes, I'm here because someone decided to target my family with a public sign. It was harassment, it was racial, and it violated HOA rules. I have documentation." He held up his phone. Linda glanced briefly, fingers drumming a polished desk. "We see. But the board cannot take action on expressions of concern unless there's formal complaint paperwork filed beforehand." "You mean it's okay for someone to humiliate my family as long as it's premeditated and coordinated?" Marcus asked, keeping his voice low but sharp. "Because that's what happened yesterday." The tension in the room thickened. Carl shifted slightly in his chair, smirk flickering. "Mr. Reed, it's just a misunderstanding. We all have the community's best interests at heart." Denise stepped forward, voice cutting like a knife. "Misunderstanding. The sign literally says property values matter. That's coded language. That's intimidation. You can't dress it up as civility." A murmur ran through the other members. Marcus noticed the subtle shifts, the way some avoided eye contact, the way a couple of older women exchanged quiet whispers. The room wasn't neutral. It had walls, yes, but it also had sides, and Marcus and his family had just learned they were considered the other. Linda sighed. "We can encourage Carl to remove the sign voluntarily. Beyond that," she trailed off. Marcus leaned forward. "Beyond that, nothing. So harassment is encouraged if it's subtle enough. If the neighbors pretend not to notice." Carl scoffed. "You're making this personal. It's just property values." "Property values," Marcus repeated, "are meaningless if they're used to justify oppression." The room went quiet, the weight of his words landing. Carl's jaw tightened, the smirk fading into something brittle. He wasn't used to being confronted in public, in a room full of witnesses who weren't entirely complicit. After what felt like a pause stretched into minutes, Marcus spoke again, calmer this time. I will document everything from now on. Every call, every meeting, every comment. This isn't about confrontation anymore. It's about accountability. Denise added, softly but firmly. And if the board refuses to act, we'll go higher. Legal counsel. Media. We're not playing by your rules anymore. Kayla, who had been silent, leaned in. You mean fight back? Marcus glanced at her, nodding. Exactly. But smartly. Strategically. No mistakes. Carl's lips pressed into a thin line. He had expected silence, or maybe anger that fizzled quickly. Instead, he was facing methodical defiance. He couldn't laugh it off anymore, couldn't wave it away. By the time the meeting ended, Marcus and Denise had walked out with a notebook filled with notes and a renewed sense of purpose. Outside, the sun was fading, and the cul-de-sac felt different. Not hostile exactly, but wary. Marcus noticed the neighbors' eyes following them. Some lingered a little too long on the Reeds' confident stride. Others pretended not to notice, glancing down at phones or over fences. A van pulled up, and a young journalist stepped out, notebook in hand, eyes scanning the neighborhood. Marcus caught her glance. She raised a hand in greeting. Neighborhood story? Marcus asked cautiously. She smiled faintly. Could be. Depends who's talking and who's willing to be honest. Marcus felt a flicker of hope. If the truth could be told, maybe the intimidation wouldn't last. Maybe Carl's carefully built aura of control could be cracked. That night, at the Reed house, the family sat together in the living room. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sounds of neighbors' televisions, and the soft flicker of the porch lights outside all felt charged with possibility. Denise poured herself a cup of tea. We keep calm, keep records. Let them make mistakes, she said. Marcus nodded, watching the street through the window, seeing Carl's house dimly lit in the distance. For the first time, he didn't feel like a passive target. He felt like a strategist in a game that Carl had thought he controlled. And somewhere deep inside, he knew. The next move would shake the neighborhood more than anyone anticipated. Carl Whitman's whisper network moved faster than Marcus expected. By Friday morning, the cul-de-sac was alive with half-truths and assumptions. A neighbor's dog barked incessantly as Marcus pulled into the driveway, but it wasn't the noise that got his attention. It was the way Mr. Thornton across the street gave him a cold, assessing stare, then quickly looked away when Marcus caught it. Inside the house, Denise was already on a call. Yes, I understand, she said sharply, fingers tapping the countertop. But the facts are clear. My husband owns the property legitimately. We have full documentation, and any insinuation otherwise is libelous. She hung up, exhaling slowly, rubbing her temples. Carl's spreading stories about us. That's what this is. Old money versus new money, rumor versus reality. Marcus leaned against the island, watching her. Old money thinks they can scare people out of neighborhoods. But we aren't running. Not just that, Denise said, her voice low, controlled. They're trying to make it personal. Finance, background, trust funds. You name it, they're twisting it. Kayla appeared at the doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. Someone on the group chat said Mr. Whitman's neighbors are convinced we're pretending to be rich. They think it's a scam. Marcus felt a mix of irritation and disbelief. Pretending, he muttered. They think wealth is a mask. They can't believe we earned it, or built it, without their permission. By late afternoon, the Reeds had a small neighborhood gathering outside their house. Friends from work, a few colleagues, and a couple of allies from community boards. Carl arrived, of course, drawn like a moth to flame, expecting confrontation or perhaps submission. Marcus, Carl said, extending a hand Marcus didn't take. Still flaunting your success. Marcus met his gaze evenly. It's not flaunting. It's visibility. Something you're unfamiliar with, apparently. Carl chuckled, but it was forced. Investment returns. Trust funds. The whole story seems convenient, don't you think? You mean inconvenient? Denise interjected, stepping beside Marcus. Because it doesn't fit your narrative of who belongs here and who doesn't. A neighbor, Mrs. Elkins, shifted uneasily on her feet. We want everyone to get along, she said, glancing from Carl to the Reeds. Get along doesn't mean you spread lies, Marcus replied. His voice was low, but sharp enough that a few heads turned. It doesn't mean you try to make us feel unwelcome with half-truths and insinuations. It doesn't mean that a cardboard sign across the street represents justice. Carl's lips pressed into a thin line. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. People like you think money changes everything. But character, true character, isn't measured by what's in a bank account. Marcus smiled faintly, cold. Funny, he said. Because we're about to show exactly whose character is visible under the light. A small crowd had formed, neighbors now more curious than judgmental. Cameras flickered. Phones lifted. Carl realized too late that the very thing he relied on, ignorance, silence, secrecy, was cracking. Denise took Marcus's arm. Let's not play his game. Not yet. Inside the house later, Marcus opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of documents. Investment statements, property deeds, charitable donations, and tax filings. These are the pieces, he said. Not for him, not for the neighborhood, but for when we need to respond. Precisely, legally, undeniable. Kayla hovered over the edge of the kitchen counter. You really think he'll back down? Marcus shrugged. I don't know. But I know his plan depends on fear. Once we remove that, he has nothing. Evening brought more whispers. Marcus noticed cars slowing down as they passed the Reed's house. Some neighbors waved politely. Others muttered under their breath. Carl Whitman's confidence seemed to falter incrementally. He had thought the Reeds could be intimidated, bullied into silence. But each conversation, each meeting, each factual revelation chipped away at the aura he had relied upon. By late night, Denise and Marcus sat on the porch with mugs of tea. The air was cool, the distant streetlights casting long shadows. Marcus sipped slowly, watching the house across the street. Carl's silhouette lingered in a second-floor window, a figure framed in dim light, fuming silently. He'll keep pushing, Denise said. But he's starting to realize he can't control everything. We've documented, we've exposed him socially, and now, she smiled faintly, we're ready for what comes next. Marcus nodded. We've given him the first hint that the game has changed. No more underestimating. No more pretending he's untouchable. A distant rumble from the street echoed softly. Delivery trucks, cars, life moving on. But Marcus felt it as a signal. The first cracks in Carl's carefully constructed power were now visible. What had been casual whispers and clandestine rumors would soon meet evidence, confrontation, and the truth laid bare. Marcus leaned back, watching Kayla fiddle with a bracelet. He realized that despite the harassment, the lies, the subtle racism threading through the neighborhood, the Reeds had one advantage Carl never would: patience, preparation, and the courage to stand, unflinching in plain sight. And somewhere, deep inside, Marcus smiled faintly to himself. Carl's next move wouldn't just fail. It would start a domino effect he wasn't ready for. The knock at the door came just after 9. Marcus was pouring coffee when Denise answered. 2 men in crisp city-issued uniforms stood on the porch, clipboards in hand, their expressions neutral but rigid. City inspection, the taller one said. We're here to conduct a standard audit of your property. Marcus frowned. An audit? Did someone file a complaint? Yes, sir, the shorter man replied, flipping through papers. Neighbor complaint regarding zoning violations and property modifications. Denise stepped forward, hand on Marcus's arm. And what specifically are you investigating? Everything, the tall one said. Exterior renovations, landscaping, occupancy permits. Standard procedure. Marcus noticed the subtle emphasis, the way the men avoided eye contact. Carl Whitman had pulled strings. Of that he was certain. Marcus nodded slowly. Then let's proceed. We have everything ready. Permits, approvals, inspections. All up to code. The men followed him outside, clipboards raised. Marcus could see Kayla watching from the window, tense. Denise lingered in the doorway, alert, her hand unconsciously resting on the railing. Carl appeared across the street, peering from behind his hedge. Marcus felt the familiar sting of being watched, the weight of premeditated scrutiny. "Mr. Reed, are you aware that zoning rules are extremely strict regarding driveway width and exterior color?" the shorter inspector asked, flipping through pages. "Yes," Marcus replied evenly. "And we're fully compliant. All permits were obtained through the city, approved and filed. You may verify anything you like." The inspectors exchanged glances. The taller one said, "We'll take note. Standard procedure. It's just unusual for someone to submit all paperwork in advance." "Unusual?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but sharp. "Are you implying wrongdoing?" "No, sir," the shorter one said, raising his hands. "Just uncommon." Carl's figure moved slightly, whispering into a phone. Marcus watched, mind calculating. Carl's power had always relied on selective enforcement, police ignoring complaints from him, neighbors assuming guilt, city officials being nudged quietly. But Marcus had anticipated this. After an hour of methodical inspection, Marcus invited the men inside to review the paperwork. Every page, every signature, every permit was meticulously organized. Marcus could see the hesitation creep into the inspectors' faces. "You've anticipated every requirement," the tall inspector admitted. "Most properties in this situation have gaps. Preparation is key," Marcus said simply. "We comply. Always." Meanwhile, Denise had begun documenting the inspection herself. Photos, notes, timestamps. The phone camera clicked softly, unseen by Carl, unseen by the inspector's unspoken deference to authority. Carl moved closer, stepping onto the sidewalk. "You think these papers intimidate me?" he called, voice brittle. Marcus met his gaze evenly. "No, they inform. There's a difference. You're turning bureaucracy into a weapon," Carl spat, frustration rising. "Bureaucracy doesn't belong to you," Marcus replied. "It belongs to the law, to procedure, and to fairness. Something you've been ignoring." Carl clenched his jaw, fists at his sides. Marcus could see the disbelief, the realization that all the shortcuts, all the whispered threats, all the silent assumptions, were ineffective against documentation, against preparation, against proof. Inside, the inspectors began to file their report. Marcus noticed subtle changes. Notes about compliance, remarks confirming permits, a neutral assessment that underlined exactly what Carl had hoped would be manipulated. By the time they left, Marcus felt a cautious victory settle in. He had not just survived the attempt at intimidation. He had exposed it. And the record existed, silent but undeniable, for anyone who doubted the Reeds' legitimacy. Denise exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "This is only the first wave," she said. "He'll try something else. But at least we've forced him into daylight." Marcus nodded. "Every move he makes now is documented. Every manipulation, every whispered complaint, every rumor, there's a trail. That's leverage." Kayla peeked around the corner. "Do you think he'll stop?" "Not yet," Marcus said, watching Carl retreat across the street, muttering into his phone. "But he's learning something new. Control isn't guaranteed. Intimidation is only powerful when the target is unprepared. We're not unprepared." Later that night, Marcus reviewed the documents again, placing each permit, each official letter, each photograph into a binder labeled Audit and Compliance. Denise joined him, hand on his shoulder. "He thought he could bend the system to his will," she said softly. "He didn't count on us being ready, on us knowing the rules as well as he does, or better." Marcus closed the binder, firm. "It's just the beginning. But every step he takes now leaves evidence behind. And that evidence is going to be important." Outside, the neighborhood streetlights flickered over silent lawns. The Reeds' home stood firm and illuminated, a quiet beacon against the creeping darkness of Carl's whispered power. Marcus knew the coming days would be a war of patience, strategy, and endurance. But for the first time, he felt an unmistakable sense of control, proof that fear could be countered, that preparation could neutralize intimidation, and that Carl Whitman's arrogance had a visible, unavoidable flaw. And deep inside, Marcus allowed himself a small, quiet satisfaction. The first domino had been set. It only needed one careful push. By midweek, Marcus realized Carl Whitman had escalated beyond whispers and HOA meetings. The Reeds' mailboxes were strewn with anonymous notes, some polite enough to pretend civility, others dripping with thinly veiled malice. But this time, Carl had taken a risk that would prove his undoing. It started with the first neighborhood security camera. A faint knock on the door at 7 a.m. revealed a local journalist, notebook and camera in hand. "Mr. Reed?" she asked, voice careful but eager. "I heard about the sign, the harassment, the HOA complaints. May I speak with you?" Marcus nodded slowly, sensing the importance. "Come inside. Let's be clear. Nothing we discuss is staged. Everything is documented. Every interaction, every threat, every rumor." The journalist, a young woman named Elise, flipped open her notebook, eyes scanning the room. "I've seen your posts online. The documentation you've collected. It's extensive. But what I'm interested in is the harassment, the subtler moments, the ones people overlook." Denise handed her a folder filled with emails, letters, and photographs. "We've kept meticulous records. And the street cameras. They captured more than just your average dispute." Marcus leaned back, recounting the details. Carl coordinated with neighbors. Quietly, systematically. Meetings behind closed doors. Complaints filed selectively. But the cameras didn't lie. Elise looked up. "You mean, evidence of orchestration?" "Yes," Marcus said. "We have timestamps, conversations." He thought it would stay invisible. But the footage tells a story he can't control. Across the street, through the window, Marcus noticed Carl pacing. His phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp, quick. The smug confidence from last week had faded. He had no idea the Reeds had a real record of his actions, proof that could expose patterns of harassment and selective enforcement. Elise's camera clicked as she filmed clips Marcus provided. Marcus and Denise walked her through the moments. Carl instructing a neighbor to leave the sign up longer, a whispered conversation with an HOA member outside meeting hours, even the subtle gestures meant to intimidate the Reeds' children. Each moment seemed small alone, but together, they painted a precise picture of manipulation. "You've been meticulous," Elise said, scrolling through her phone. "Most people wouldn't notice these things, or would ignore them. But this is systemic." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the statement. "Systemic," he repeated. "That's the problem. Not a single act is isolated. The pattern is deliberate. That's why documentation matters. Because when the truth is undeniable, he has nowhere to hide." Denise leaned closer, voice low. "And that's the key. It's not revenge. It's accountability. The cameras just make it visible to everyone else." Meanwhile, Kayla had found her own vantage point. From her bedroom window, she filmed Carl pacing back and forth. His gestures, his expressions, his attempts at composure, all captured unintentionally. Later, Elise asked, "So this footage, you're going public?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. First, we need to understand how the city, the HOA, and the neighborhood react. If he tries to manipulate further, we'll have proof. If he overplays his hand, it becomes undeniable." "Sounds like a chess game," Elise said, raising an eyebrow. "Exactly," Marcus replied. "And he's about to find out the board is stacked against him, not us." By evening, the footage was organized into a timeline. Denise added notes. Dates, times, interactions. Every act of intimidation had a corresponding timestamp and witness note. Marcus watched the screen and felt the first real relief. They weren't powerless. They were prepared, documented, and methodical. Carl, unaware, continued his usual evening strolls, phone pressed to his ear. He had no idea how exposed he had become, how every move he made was visible and traceable. Marcus turned to Denise. We can't underestimate him. But each step he takes now creates more evidence. He's trapped in his own narrative. Denise smiled faintly, sipping tea. Let him try to spin it. We have the visuals, the timestamps, the witnesses. It's only a matter of time before the truth is undeniable. Evening shadows fell across the cul-de-sac. The Reed's house glowed warmly, calm, organized, a stark contrast to the tension rippling through Carl's household. Outside, streetlights flickered, and the quiet hum of distant traffic carried the weight of impending exposure. Kayla lowered her camera, eyes bright with understanding. So the cameras, they don't lie. No, Marcus said softly. They capture what people think is invisible. And once it's captured, it can't be erased. That's power. Denise reached for Marcus's hand. Power with truth, not aggression. That's how we win. Marcus exhaled, letting the tension seep out. The first wave of public exposure was ready. The narrative Carl had tried to control, silent intimidation, coded threats, selective harassment, was now visible. And the world beyond the cul-de-sac, through Elise and the careful documentation, would soon see exactly what had been happening all along. Outside, Carl's shadow moved past the streetlight, but this time it looked smaller, uncertain. The meticulous strategy Marcus and Denise had built was already pressing against him, forcing him to improvise where he had once relied on certainty. And deep in his chest, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. The system that Carl had manipulated for decades was beginning to turn against him, one documented moment at a time. The first domino had fallen. The weekend brought more tension than relief. Carl Whitman had gone quiet in the neighborhood. His usual boasting replaced with muttered phone calls and hurried whispers. Marcus noticed it immediately as he drove Kayla to her piano lesson, Carl peering from the corner of his porch, hands gripping the railing like he was about to lose balance. By late afternoon, the Reeds invited a few friends over to celebrate small victories. Documented HOA complaints, verified inspections, and the quiet unraveling of Carl's intimidation. Marcus and Denise knew, though, that Carl was still calculating his next move, still trying to find a crack in their armor. The knock came mid-celebration. Marcus opened the door to Carl, standing there with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Marcus, Carl said, voice tight. Can we talk? Marcus's hand rested casually on the doorframe. About what? The sign. The inspections. The cameras. Carl's jaw tightened. You know what I mean. I just want to understand something. How does a family like yours manage all this? I mean financially. Investments, properties. It's not typical for new arrivals. Denise exchanged a glance with Marcus. Typical. Carl, your assumptions about who belongs here have been predictable. Carl's face reddened. I'm not assuming anything. I'm curious. Marcus's voice was calm, almost conversational. Curiosity that borders on condescension. Carl flinched. I don't understand. It's hard to believe someone can be so established without family money, connections, or without approval, Marcus said, finishing his thought. You mean without your blessing? Carl's laugh was brittle, nervous. Something like that. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, letting silence stretch. Finally he said, We've earned it. Hard work, smart investments, long nights, long days. We built what we have. Not inherited it, not manipulated it. Built it. Carl's eyes narrowed. And yet, you flaunt it. Display it publicly. Surely you know that intimidates people. Marcus shook his head. No. We live. Visibility doesn't intimidate. It informs. And yes, perhaps it's uncomfortable for you. But that discomfort is yours to manage, not ours to hide. Denise stepped closer. Carl, the truth is simple. We're successful. You assumed otherwise because of us. You assumed we weren't deserving. You assumed money, character, and belonging were things you could dictate. You were wrong. Carl opened his mouth, closed it, and tried again. So, this is your way of telling me you're untouchable? Marcus smiled faintly, cold. Untouchable? Well, we're accountable, visible, and prepared. But untouchable? That would require ignorance on your part. And Carl, you're running out of ignorance to exploit. Carl's fists clenched at his sides. And the neighbors? You'll show them everything. Denise's eyes sparkled. Eventually. But we don't need to threaten anyone. The truth is clear. It's already documented. The cameras, the audits, the HOA missteps. Proof doesn't need persuasion. It just exists. Carl's confidence wavered. He took a step back, suddenly aware of the subtle audience behind him. A few neighbors had wandered onto their lawns, pretending to water plants or fetch mail, but listening nonetheless. His authority, the carefully constructed web of fear and selective enforcement, was unraveling in real time. Marcus's voice softened, deceptively casual. Do you know what people fear most, Carl? Not money. Not success. Truth. That's why the sign, the whispers, the complaints, they all failed. Because the truth can't be silenced. Carl's jaw tightened, silence stretching. His mind raced through all the assumptions he had made. That wealth was a mask, that influence and old money would always overpower new presence, that intimidation was enough. But none of it worked here. None of it had worked. Denise stepped forward, placing a hand lightly on Marcus's shoulder. Carl, consider this your final question. Yes, we have resources. Yes, we have investments and properties you couldn't imagine. But more importantly, we have preparation, documentation, and resilience. And those aren't things you can buy, manipulate, or intimidate. For the first time, Carl faltered visibly. His voice dropped to a whisper. I didn't think. You didn't think we'd be ready, Marcus said softly, almost kindly. You didn't think we'd anticipate your moves, expose them, and prepare for them. That's the flaw in your arrogance, Carl. You assumed fear would keep us small. But we've been nothing but visible from the start. Carl took a hesitant step back. His phone buzzed urgently in his pocket. He glanced at it, then at the quiet audience of neighbors, then back at the Reeds. There was no bravado left, no smugness, just realization. Marcus closed the door slowly, letting Carl stand there, uninvited, powerless for once. Denise locked the door behind him, and the family leaned against it, letting the tension release. Kayla peeked out from the living room. So, he knows now. Marcus nodded. He knows. And it's worse than he expected. Denise exhaled, sipping her tea. It's not over yet, but it's shifting. The imbalance. He assumed it would always be in his favor. Now he's learning something he hasn't accounted for. Preparation, truth, and resilience are more powerful than intimidation. Outside, Carl Whitman's figure retreated into the shadows of his house, shoulders hunched, expression tight. The neighbors who had watched discreetly now whispered among themselves. Murmurs of curiosity, of doubt, of realization spread across lawns, drifting quietly through the cul-de-sac. Inside, the Reeds sat together, the weight of the week's battles lingering, but a new energy threading through the room. Marcus watched the fading light, feeling the subtle shift. Carl's carefully constructed empire of fear was starting to crumble, one documented truth, one visible fact at a time. And deep inside, Marcus allowed himself a quiet, steadying thought. Carl Whitman's next move would reveal everything, and this time the Reeds would be ready for it. The day the story broke, Marcus felt a mixture of anticipation and calm. Elise, the journalist, had gone live online, posting clips from the neighborhood cameras, excerpts from inspection reports, and snippets of the Reeds' meticulously documented evidence. Within hours, the cul-de-sac and city were abuzz. Marcus scrolled through the flood of comments, some supportive, some incredulous. How could someone assume intimidation would work? One read, "Finally accountability." Another said, "This shows the neighborhood culture was complicit for too long." Denise leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded. This is bigger than we imagined. But it's the truth. And the truth travels fast. Marcus nodded. It's not revenge, Denise. It's clarity. Proof that harassment isn't invisible, and people can't just shrug it off anymore. By afternoon, Carl Whitman's phone was ringing non-stop. Neighbors who had once nodded politely at him avoided eye contact. Whispers replaced conversations. The man who had once dictated the mood of the street was now reacting defensively, unsure how to repair his reputation. A call came from the HOA president, Linda Hargrove, her voice unusually stiff. Mr. Reed, the board has reviewed the materials. We acknowledge oversight and procedural failures. We want to ensure nothing like this happens again. Marcus's smile was controlled. Acknowledgement is a start. But accountability isn't optional. Documentation has been submitted to the city council and civil authorities. That's where this will be formalized. Civil authorities. Linda hesitated. We were hoping this could be handled quietly. Marcus shook his head. Quiet handling enabled the harassment in the first place. Exposure is the only method that works against selective enforcement. Carl Whitman appeared on the porch, fuming, a half-dozen city officials and journalists arriving at the street's edge. His carefully constructed image of composure was cracking under public scrutiny. You think this proves something? Carl barked, gesturing toward the Reed's house. It proves what's always been there, Marcus said, voice steady. You orchestrated harassment. You spread rumors. You used your influence to intimidate, manipulate, and isolate. And now it's documented. Denise added, quietly but firmly. And it's not personal. It's procedural. The law, the documentation, the cameras. They all tell the story you hoped would remain invisible. The journalists had their cameras rolling. Neighbors pressed near the sidewalks, phones recording. Marcus could see Carl faltering. He gestured to a city inspector. Is this legally legit? The inspector, clipboard in hand, nodded. All documentation is in order. The Reeds have complied fully. Complaints against them were unfounded. Actions against Carl Whitman and HOA members are under review for misuse of authority. Carl's voice dropped. You can't. This is ridiculous. A neighbor spoke from the crowd. You can't dictate who belongs here. Maybe it's time you understand that, Carl. Another chimed in. And maybe read the bylaws yourself instead of twisting them for your benefit. The public exposure was immediate and undeniable. News outlets had picked up the story, amplifying every documented moment. The sign, the whispered instructions, the selective complaints, the HOA's collusion. Carl's influence, carefully cultivated for decades, was crumbling under scrutiny. Marcus watched it unfold, quiet satisfaction mixing with lingering tension. It's poetic, isn't it? He said to Denise. The system he relied on to intimidate now holds him accountable. Denise nodded. But notice, he's still dangerous. Arrogance doesn't die easily. We have to see this through. Elise, the journalist, approached. Mr. Reed, this story. It's resonating. People are calling for reform, for stricter oversight. The evidence you provided is clear, compelling, undeniable. Marcus shook his head slightly. It's not about the applause. It's about what happens next. If Carl learns there are consequences for abusing power, others will notice too. Carl tried to interrupt, but officials had gathered at the curb. You're under investigation for misuse of HOA authority, harassment, and intimidation, one said. Further action will be determined by the council and legal authorities. The air was thick with tension, but Marcus felt a release. Carl's carefully maintained empire of fear had collapsed under exposure and law. It wasn't just humiliation. It was consequence, systemic, legal, and social. By evening, the street had quieted. Neighbors lingered in small groups, discussing the implications, sharing notes, reflecting on what they had witnessed. Some offered quiet nods to the Reeds as they walked home. Marcus realized that the neighborhood itself had shifted. the social contract recalibrated by transparency and truth. Inside, Marcus and Denise sat together, sipping tea. Kayla rested nearby, scrolling through news clips on her phone. "They're showing everything," she said. "Yes," Marcus said softly. "And it's not about showing off. It's about accountability. That's what Carl didn't understand." Denise reached for his hand. "He'll face the consequences. But we should never forget, the cost to us has been emotional, exhausting, even frightening at times. Exposure works, but it leaves scars." Marcus nodded, letting the truth sink in. They had won legally and socially, but the experience had left marks. Lessons in vigilance, resilience, and the importance of preparation. Carl's downfall was real, undeniable, and deserved. Yet the Reeds' triumph came tempered by awareness of what they had endured. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, illuminating the Reeds' house and the now subdued Carl Whitman retreating into his home. Justice, slow and deliberate, had arrived, but it came with reminders that vigilance and courage were required every step of the way. And deep inside, Marcus allowed himself one thought: the neighborhood, the community, and even Carl would never be the same again. The morning after the public exposure, the neighborhood felt different. Lighter yet tense, as if a collective weight had been lifted but left everyone slightly unsteady. Marcus stepped onto the porch, inhaling the crisp air. Across the street, Carl Whitman's house was quiet. No figure behind the curtains, no confident stride on the sidewalk, no smirk lurking in the shadows. Inside, Denise poured coffee for the three of them. Kayla sat at the kitchen counter, earbuds in, but eyes fixed on the family group chat buzzing with messages. Neighbors sharing thoughts, local media links, and tentative apologies. "They're actually talking to us now," Kayla said, almost in disbelief. Denise nodded, sipping her coffee. "Some of them are just curious. Others are realizing they ignored things for too long. Carl isn't the only one who assumed silence was compliance." Marcus leaned against the doorway, scanning the quiet street. Carl's gone silent, and it's telling. The legal complaints, the HOA investigations, the media coverage. It's all too much for him. His reputation, carefully constructed for decades, is unraveling. Denise frowned slightly. "Don't underestimate him. People like Carl don't disappear quietly. Even when they're exposed, they try to manipulate to regain control." Marcus shook his head. "He can't. Not now. We have everything documented. Inspections, recordings, timestamps, public posts. Any attempt to regain control will be traceable. He's trapped by his own arrogance." Kayla leaned back, finally removing her earbuds. "So, he can't come after us anymore?" Marcus offered a small smile. "He can try, but we're prepared. Every move, every word, every action recorded. Public, legal, and undeniable. That's the difference between someone with power and someone who relies on it." Later that afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Elkins, knocked on the Reeds' door. Marcus opened it to find her holding a small basket of baked goods. Her expression cautious but sincere. I just wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "For ignoring the sign, for whispering, for letting things continue. I see now. You didn't need to flaunt, you didn't need to prove anything. You just lived, and that's what scared some of us. It shouldn't have been this hard for you." Denise smiled gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Elkins. It takes courage to admit when you've been silent in the wrong. That's the first step toward change." Marcus nodded. "We're not here to humiliate anyone. We're here to ensure fairness, accountability, and respect. That's what matters." By evening, the Reeds gathered in their living room, the house warm and quiet. Kayla sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching while Denise and Marcus reviewed emails from the city council and HOA. Carl's latest messages were terse, defensive, and carefully worded, an attempt at damage control now too late. "He's trying to salvage his reputation," Denise noted. "But anyone paying attention knows the truth. No one can ignore what's been documented." Marcus rubbed his temples. "It's strange, isn't it? The truth can be messy, exhausting, even frightening to enforce. But once it's out there, it changes everything. Kayla looked up. Do you think he'll leave? Marcus smiled faintly. He may stay physically, but socially and reputationally he's gone. People will remember how he treated us, and that memory carries more weight than anything he owns. A week later, the neighborhood meetings changed tone. HOA sessions now included new members advocating for transparency and fairness. Conversations on front porches became less about gossip and more about mutual respect. Carl Whitman attended one meeting, visibly smaller, voice restrained, questions carefully measured. No one ignored him, but no one deferred to him either. Marcus watched quietly from the back, Denise by his side. It's not just about us, he said. It's about changing the culture. Accountability matters, and visibility enforces it. Denise reached for his hand. You did it, Marcus. Not with anger, not with vengeance, but with preparation, strategy, and courage. That's what changed everything. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, illuminating neatly kept lawns. The Reeds' home stood firm, warm, and inviting. Shadows from the past lingered but were now softened, the tension replaced by a cautious optimism. Later that night, as Marcus tucked Kayla into bed, she whispered, I feel safe now, like we belong. Marcus kissed her forehead. You always did. And now everyone else knows it too. Downstairs, Denise closed the last binder labeled Audit and Compliance. The weight of months of vigilance and struggle lingered, but it was paired with satisfaction. The Reeds had endured harassment, lies, and intimidation, and they had emerged resilient, their integrity intact. Carl Whitman's downfall was complete, slow but inevitable, a consequence of arrogance and abuse of power. Marcus stepped onto the porch one last time that night. The street was quiet, the city skyline faintly glowing in the distance. He breathed in the cool air, letting the events of the past months settle. Exposure had worked, accountability had been enforced, and the neighborhood had shifted, not through fear but through truth. And deep inside, Marcus understood. The cost had been real, the scars visible, but the victory was enduring. They had survived. They had resisted. And in doing so, they had reminded everyone, including Carl Whitman, that arrogance and prejudice could be confronted, documented, and ultimately undone. The night was calm now, the street still, but a quiet hum of justice lingered, visible only to those who had the courage to see it. The Reeds had reclaimed their neighborhood, their dignity, and their truth. Carl Whitman's phone buzzed relentlessly that Monday morning. Calls from city inspectors, HOA board members, and even local media demanded responses. Marcus watched from the kitchen window as Carl's sedan crept down the cul-de-sac, windshield reflecting the early sun. The man who had once ruled this neighborhood with whispered authority now seemed diminished. His stride cautious, shoulders hunched. Inside, Denise sipped her tea calmly. Looks like the dominoes are falling, she said softly. Every manipulation, every whispered complaint, every unkind word. He's paying for it. Marcus nodded. It's one thing to be exposed publicly. It's another to face formal accountability. And that's exactly what he's encountering now. A knock at the door announced the first wave of formal action. A pair of city officials stepped onto the Reed's porch, folders and clipboards in hand. Mr. Reed, Ms. Reed, one said, voice neutral but firm. We've reviewed the neighborhood complaint history, the HOA's previous oversight, and the documentation your family submitted. Based on what we've seen, Mr. Whitman is under investigation for harassment and misuse of HOA authority. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. We anticipated that. The documentation is thorough. Any additional evidence you need, we'll provide. The officials exchanged glances, noting Marcus's calm confidence. We may need statements from neighbors as well. Those willing to testify can strengthen the case. Denise nodded. We've already encouraged them to come forward. The truth is out there. People are ready to speak. Meanwhile, across the street, Carl watched from his porch, phone pressed tightly to his ear. "This isn't fair," he barked. "You can't treat me like a criminal. I've lived here 30 years. I've contributed to the community." A neighbor, Mr. Thornton, stepped onto his lawn, arms crossed. 30 years doesn't give you the right to harass, manipulate, or intimidate your neighbors. It's over, Carl. People see it now. Carl's voice faltered. They don't understand. They can't understand. Marcus stepped outside, crossing the lawn with Denise and Kayla behind him. They understand perfectly, Marcus said. They understand what you tried to do. Use fear, influence, and selective enforcement to maintain control. And now, every step you took is recorded, verified, and undeniable. Carl's face reddened, his hands shaking slightly. I was only protecting the neighborhood. Property values. Standards. Denise's voice cut sharply, steady. Standards. Standards are meaningless when used to bully, exclude, and humiliate. You crossed the line, Carl. And now, the consequences are real. One of the city inspectors stepped forward. "Mr. Whitman, as of this morning, you are under formal review. Complaints of harassment, intimidation, and selective enforcement will be investigated. The HOA will also face scrutiny for procedural lapses." Carl's shoulders sagged. He had spent decades relying on subtle threats, influence, and the neighborhood's fear of confrontation. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for public exposure combined with legal accountability. Kayla, standing beside her parents, whispered, "He looks smaller." Marcus nodded. Arrogance collapses under scrutiny. The more you rely on it, the more fragile it becomes when confronted with evidence and truth. By afternoon, neighbors began trickling out of their homes, some cautiously offering support, others simply observing the unraveling of a man they once deferred to. Carl tried to speak to a few, pleading, rationalizing, but his words fell flat, met with quiet acknowledgement or polite dismissal. His influence had evaporated. Inside the Reeds' home, Marcus and Denise reviewed a binder filled with newly submitted statements from neighbors, documenting Carl's harassment over months and even years. "This will seal it," Denise said, her voice firm. "The city can't ignore coordinated harassment backed by evidence and testimony." Marcus nodded. "And it sets a precedent. Not just for Carl, but for everyone who assumes intimidation is invisible. The law, documentation, and community visibility together create accountability." By evening, Carl Whitman sat alone in his living room, phone silenced, emails piling up unanswered. The carefully curated image of control he had relied on for decades lay in tatters. He realized, too late, that power earned through fear was fragile and temporary. Real power, the Reed's kind, was built on preparation, truth, and resilience. Marcus and Denise stepped onto their porch later that night, watching the street in the fading light. The quiet hum of cars in the distance, the soft flicker of streetlights, and the occasional murmur of neighbors replaced the tension of previous weeks. The neighborhood had shifted. Carl's aura of dominance was gone. Marcus exhaled, placing a hand on Denise's shoulder. "The reckoning isn't just legal. Social too. Every neighbor who saw the truth and chose to stand with it contributes to lasting change." Denise nodded. "It's not about vengeance. It's about accountability, integrity, and courage. We survived harassment, intimidation, and systemic bias, and we emerged stronger." Kayla looked up from her chair. "Do you think he'll ever learn?" Marcus smiled faintly, a mix of seriousness and reassurance. "Maybe. Maybe not. But the important part is that the system works when people have courage and evidence. That lesson lasts longer than anger or punishment." Across the street, Carl Whitman's lights flickered off. His house, once imposing, now seemed like a shadow of its former dominance. The Reeds' home, warm and illuminated, stood as a quiet testament to resilience, preparation, and the strength to confront injustice without fear. Marcus allowed himself a rare, quiet smile. The neighborhood had changed, not through threats, manipulation, or silent whispers, but through courage, visibility, and truth. The dominoes had fallen, and the final reckoning had arrived. The Reeds had won. And this time the victory was lasting. The cul-de-sac had changed in subtle ways. Lawns were still manicured, porches still lined with chairs, but the air carried a new energy. Quiet respect instead of hushed judgment, observation instead of whispered suspicion. Marcus stepped onto the porch, feeling the morning sun warm his shoulders, and noticed the small but significant signs of change. Neighbors greeting each other openly, children playing without fear of hidden eyes, the absence of tension he had grown accustomed to over months of harassment. Inside, Denise prepared breakfast, smiling faintly as Kayla set the table. "You know," she said, "I almost forgot what peace felt like. It's been a long fight." Marcus leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee. "It's more than peace," he said softly. "It's clarity. Carl's influence is gone. And the neighborhood knows the difference between fear and fairness." Kayla grinned. "It's weird, people are actually nice now. Without the tension." Denise chuckled. "Not just nice, Kayla. Countable. They saw what happens when someone manipulates the system, and when truth and preparation prevail." Later that morning, Marcus received a call from Elise, the journalist who had first brought the Reed story to the public eye. "The coverage is still running strong," she said. "The city council is considering permanent reforms to HOA oversight, harassment reporting, and community transparency. People are learning from what you did." Marcus smiled faintly. It wasn't about fame. It was about visibility and accountability. Hopefully, others will see that courage and preparation can prevent injustice before it escalates. Denise, overhearing the call, added, "And it sets a precedent. Not just for Carl, but for anyone who thinks intimidation can succeed silently." The afternoon sun drew long shadows across the street. Across the cul-de-sac, Carl Whitman's house sat quiet. He had retreated into himself, no longer the confident, controlling figure he once was. Legal actions were pending. Social exposure had eroded his authority. He had lost not just the fight but the illusion of power. Marcus turned to Denise. "Do you want to take a walk?" he asked. "The street feels different today." They strolled down the cul-de-sac, Kayla skipping slightly ahead. Neighbors nodded politely, some offering quiet congratulations, others simply observing. The change wasn't dramatic, it was subtle, but it was real. The street that had once been ruled by Carl's whispered authority now felt open, breathable, and safe. As they reached the corner, Marcus paused. "You know, it's funny. Carl thought wealth, influence, and intimidation would guarantee obedience. He didn't count on preparation, truth, or resilience. Those are the real power." Denise nodded. "And courage. Courage to document, to confront, to stand visibly against injustice. That's what changed everything." Kayla turned, frowning slightly. "Do you think he'll ever come back? Try to, I don't know, do it again?" Marcus shook his head. "Not in the same way. Exposure teaches lessons. And if he tries anything else, we have everything recorded, visible, undeniable. That's deterrent, not punishment, it's protection." Later, as the sun set, the Reeds sat on their porch together, sipping iced tea, watching the quiet street. The warm glow of their house contrasted with the fading shadows around Carl's home across the way. The once imposing figure of the man who tried to intimidate them now seemed smaller, diminished, almost insignificant in the broader context of truth and justice. Denise exhaled, leaning against Marcus. "It's over," she said softly. "And yet, it feels like we've gained more than just safety. We've gained recognition of our dignity, our resilience, and our worth." Marcus nodded. "And we've shown that the system, legal, social, and moral, works when truth is presented fearlessly." Carl's downfall wasn't sudden. It was inevitable because he underestimated the power of visibility, preparation, and perseverance. Kayla looked out toward the street. "I think the neighborhood feels lighter, happier, safer. Like they finally get it." "Yes," Marcus said, voice calm, reflective. It's a lesson for everyone, not just Carl. Prejudice, intimidation, and arrogance only persist when left unchallenged. Visibility and truth dismantle them. That's the legacy here. As night fell, lights flickered on across the cul-de-sac. The Reed's house glowed warmly, a symbol of resilience and integrity. Marcus and Denise stepped inside, closing the door gently behind them, knowing the struggle had ended but the lessons would endure. Later, Marcus sat at his desk, Kayla asleep in the next room, reviewing the final binders of evidence, photographs, and documents. Each one was a reminder of the months of endurance, vigilance, and courage that had led to this moment. Carl Whitman's downfall was complete, legal, social, and personal, but the Reeds' victory was not only in his defeat. It was in their survival, their preparation, and their unwavering resolve. Denise joined him, resting her head lightly on his shoulder. "We did it," she whispered. "Yes," Marcus said, looking out the window at the quiet street. "And we did it the right way. No vengeance. Just truth, resilience, and courage. That's what changed everything." The night was still. The cul-de-sac, once a place of whispered fear, had transformed into a street of accountability, recognition, and dignity. The Reeds had reclaimed not just their home, but the moral center of their community. And deep inside, Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction. The power of preparation, courage, and truth had triumphed, leaving lasting change in its wake. And for the first time in months, the Reeds could simply breathe.